Tilea's Troubles, Part 19. Bad timing, bad intelligence, and bad behaviour. The battle. Southern Tilea, several leagues north of Pavezzano, autumn 2401. Squabbling in a big way. This report includes the original in-game pictures and a good number of prettier posed ones. Gurmlis had gone as commanded to take a look at the mysterious coastal fort, but he was not the only one from the Waagh to wander out that way. Several other goblins were meandering in the vicinity as the army continued its erratic stop-start march southwards. He rode his new chariot, having left the previous one smashed outside Pavezzano, and as the driver was doing all the work right now, he was able to think for a while. Of course, he already knew that whatever Greenskins were present at the fort were not part of Khurnag's forces, and certainly not the little Waagh, which he had personally witnessed being destroyed. Yet it still gave him satisfaction to have his conviction proved true when a wolf rider hurtled past him towards the main Waagh, shouting about enemies and forts. The rider no doubt hoped to turn the rest of the Waagh in this direction. As Gurmlis's chariot trundled along beside another, he spotted a company of wolf riders, from which the lone rider must have originated, to his left. It was a little mob led by a particularly vile goblin named Clabtoe. A pump wagon, very likely just here by chance rather than design, was rolling along in a clackety fashion to his right. As his chariot rolled into view of the enemy fort, he saw it was a ramshackle affair, typical of goblins. He could also see that the enemy were already alerted. They had formed into companies, crewed their engines, and lined their raggedly cut fences with missile troops. Gurmlis was not happy about the number of powder pieces they had. He could see lines of muzzles, big and small, resting on the plank fences. 2 cannons, half a dozen swivels, of the kind some called murderers, and a considerable number of the sort of wide-mouth handguns northern men call blunderbusses. Guns were bad news for chariots. Guns behind fences were even worse. The defences included a couple of rickety redoubts, one of which had a small artillery piece mounted inside, probably a naval gun. Beside it were some mean-looking orcs with crossbows, wearing white linen tunics almost as bright as their typically large teeth. Advancing on this particular foe was going to hurt, thought Gurmlis, at least for those unlucky enough to form the vanguard. Once the rest of the Waagh came up, and especially when Khurnag's warriors smashed their way over the fences, it would be quick, easy, and bloody work, for the main Waagh vastly outnumbered this petty band. Yes, he decided, victory would surely be Khurnag's, of that there was no doubt, but anyone who went in first would almost certainly not be around to enjoy the spoils. The only gate Gurmlis could see was covered by 5 brass swivels, crewed by orcs, positioned in such a way that to enter the camp he would have to ride right past their muzzles. The handguns were wielded by a ragged band of goblins off on the enemy's left flank. He wondered just how well the goblins had been drilled in the loading and use of their pieces. In his own experience, the combination of clumsy gits and black powder led to a lot of accidents and very little damage to the foe. And yet, there they were, in numbers, which suggested they were entirely capable of employing their weapons correctly. Perhaps the goblins with the handguns just enjoyed the bangs and flashes enough not to care about the inevitable risks to their personal health. Inside the fort were 2 larger bodies of fighters, one an orc company, the other goblins. The orcs looked like seafarers, and for a moment Gurmlis wondered if these were the same sailors who had brought the vanguard of Khurnag's Waagh over the gulf from the Badlands. But that made no sense, because most of those orcs had been pressed into service in the Waagh, their boats and ships burned or abandoned. Besides, why would those orcs get themselves into a scrap with an army they knew to be vast? The largest enemy company, a mass of goblins, looked wilder than most of their kind. They were armed to the teeth with every sort of weapon, mostly pistols, boarding axes, and cutlasses. They had to be veteran pirates to have stolen so much stuff. A second artillery piece sat upon a fortified earthen mound above and behind the outer defences. It was much larger than the one down by the gate, and had the look of a looted dwarven piece. It was commanded by a purple-cloaked orc, whose head was enclosed in a battered, blooded metal helmet, the blood likely from whoever it was he last buttered. Although it was hard to make out the details, it looked like many of the greenskins inside the fort were engaged in an argument. No surprise there, Gurmlis thought. This day would go a lot better for him if the enemy was distracted and divided. Yet, as Clabto's wolf riders began to close on the walls, it became obvious that not all the enemy was bickering. The crossbows and gunners by the gate seemed to be busying themselves for the fight. When the cannon's blast came, it was loud enough to make Gurmlis's wolf team jolt his chariot. The effect on Clabto's wolf riders was somewhat more serious, and combined with the squall of iron-tipped bolts that issued from the crossbows, it caused the surviving wolf riders to flee, Clabto included. Gurmlis grinned. He'd never liked Clabto, and was glad it was him who had been stung first. Glancing behind, he now saw that the excitable goblin rider had successfully summoned several other companies of riders from the Waagh. No less than warlord Khurnag himself had arrived, with his bodyguard of boar riders, while Thagger's big uns came up beside them. It seemed Khurnag had not bothered to prepare and mount his wyvern, but instead had simply trotted over, riding upon his travelling boar. A boar chariot also trundled into view, as well as a goblin shaman whose name Gurmlis had never managed to pronounce, admittedly not having tried to do so often. You or him usually sufficed. Khurnag was riding his giant boar Butter, whose oversized tusks were rivalled in the passel only by the curved horns on Khurnag's helmet. He was not in his full war gear, which might reveal how little he was concerned about tackling this present foe. His boar rider bodyguards carried his personal standard, a pole adorned with the rotting skull of the Minotaur Khurnag famously felled during the Battle of Foulmire. Thagger's big uns thundered up on the flank, their heavy hooves making more noise than Khurnag's guards with thrice their number. Their own ragged banner had once been the personal standard of the Badlands war boss Gravel the Red, who had been toppled from his wyvern mount by Khurnag, then skewered on Thagger's spear. That was the day Khurnag had declared Thagger should command his own riders. Laughing, the war boss had added, "I don't want to have to do all the battering and bashing, and then have you stick your spear in and spoil my fun before I'm done." Thagger's nickname amongst the Waagh's goblins had been Spoiler ever since. Now that Khurnag was on the field, all those who had previously been milling about began to move more directly towards the foe, with Khurnag and his boar riders moving quickest. Gurmlis himself, eager to repair his reputation in Khurnag's eyes, despite the fear gnawing at the pit of his stomach because of all the guns, was right out in front, his hurtling chariot bouncing so much he had to hold on with all his might. He tried not to look at the swivel gunners, hoping they might similarly pay no attention to him. Besides, did they not now have much better targets to occupy them than a goblin chariot, what with a large passel of boars thundering to his right and the clattering pump wagon behind him? The arguments were apparently still raging inside the fort. The sharp retort of a handgun or two rang out, and Gurmlis felt his throat tighten as he anticipated a lead shot tearing through him. But the shots had been aimed at targets within the fort. An orc fell screaming, prompting several others to run from their ranks and begin hacking furiously at the goblin handgunners, killing a good number. When the cannons boomed, causing Gurmlis to jump a second time, not something one should do too often when riding a careening chariot, they were aiming at the advancing enemy. Luckily, not at him, but at the boar riders, felling one of them. Better still, the crossbow orcs also chose not to trouble him and his chariot, instead bringing down another boar rider. Gurmlis was beginning to enjoy this. Behind the vanguard, more regiments from the Waagh were arriving, only to end up in an altercation with Clabtoe's recently rallied wolf riders. Gurmlis learned later that Clabtoe had declared that he was leaving, saying that he did not come all this way to fight orcs and gobs in a ramshackle fort, with most likely no loot at all up for grabs. He came to kill men for shiny treasures of gold and silver, not to squabble with greenskins over turd piles and scraggy kine like back home. The newly arrived troops were somewhat annoyed at the goblin boss's exhibition of truculence, and took it upon themselves to convince him and his riders, in a bloody manner, to turn around. As an orc boss put it, Clabtoe and his lads were going to attack the fort, and they were going first. What resulted was a messy squabble, ironically not at all dissimilar to what Clabtoe had claimed he did not like about back home, which meant that the newly arrived ogre leadbelchers had to waste time marching perpendicular to the battlefront in order to circumnavigate the riot. The fort's defenders now did something that Gurmlis really did not expect. The goblin handgunners climbed the fence and ran out towards Khurnag's boar rider guard. Perhaps they were simply trying to get away from their supposed allies within the fort, having lost 5 of their number to the orc pirates' blows. The orc swivel gunners unleashed a volley of sangrenel scrap iron, only to witness 2 of their own barrels shiver apart and kill the gunners wielding them. When the intact guns failed visibly to harm any of Khurnag's warriors, Gurmlis assumed that their powder must be rotten. The 3 surviving orcs were momentarily stunned, then frantically began stuffing powder and shot into their barrels. While the pirate orcs loosed a sting of pistol shots, bringing down another of Khurnag's boar boys, and a cannonball smashed the chariot behind Gurmlis's own, more and more regiments from the Waagh were arriving at the field of battle. Boar chariots, spear chuckers, a big regiment of boys, although not the Waagh's largest, and the Waagh's army standard-bearer, Big Boss Malky the Fist. Not that many of these units made much headway, as the argument involving Clabtoe's wolf riders now engendered a bad-tempered contrariness which spread contagiously, disgruntling several other bodies and slowing their advance to a crawl. 2 orc boys had died to goblin wolf riders' arrows. Then 2 wolf riders died before they could escape the vengeful orc's wrath. As they fled in terror, it dawned on only one among them that they were now indeed heading back towards the fort. At the real fighting front, Spoiler's boar riders chased after the goblin handgunners who had fled immediately, no doubt subtly aware of the utter insanity of their decision to leap the fence and head out alone. Meanwhile, Khurnag led his own much larger body of boar riders to charge the crossbow orcs at the little gate, losing one of his boys to a fall as they tried to negotiate the fence. The crossbow orcs were hacked apart quickly and efficiently, until only one remained, who then turned to flee, being chased down by Khurnag and his lads. Gurmlis watched as the orc warboss and his regiment of riders' momentum carried them into the little wooden bastion containing the foremost cannon, where they set about bashing the goblin crew and their bully with glee. A thunderous boom sent an iron round shot over the boar riders' heads to bounce across the field and tear an ogre leadbelcher in 2. But Khurnag and his boys did not let it distract them, as they tore the terrified cannon crew to pieces. Gurmlis was not the only one watching them, as inside the fort the goblin pirates stared with sick fascination, as well as considerable gut-wrenching trepidation. They readied their ranks and files to face Khurnag as best they could, their shattered ship's wheel standard held at their front. More and more elements of the Waagh were arriving to add to the confusion and general milling about at the rear of the Greenskins' line. Another pump wagon trundled onto the field, as well as a large body of mercenary ogres. Growing more crazed by the minute, Clabtoe persisted in his disagreement with every other Greenskin regiment around, so that the ogres had to march around the growing riot up to where their recently battered cannon-wielding comrades were. Undaunted by a flimsy fence, Khurnag led his boar riders into a charge against the goblin pirates, and was himself blooded in the thigh by a shiver of wood as his boar butter crashed through the defences. Another boar rider fell to the goblins' counter-shot, but when the riders hit, they hit hard. The goblin pirate's leader, wearing a large hat decorated with a yellow feather, seemed dazed by the turn of events, and was felled swiftly by one of the boar boy's spears. The rest of the goblins quickly gave up the struggle and hurtled away in panic. Unwilling to chase such a pathetic and broken foe, Khurnag halted his lads and ordered them to turn to face inside the fort. There they saw that Gurmlis had manoeuvred his chariot through the gate, while the 3 intact swivel guns had destroyed the pump wagon. Now the last of the foe was surrounded on 2 sides by Khurnag's Waagh, not only from outside their defences. Khurnag was about to bellow Waagh and charge in, when instead his boys began squabbling over looted pistols they had taken from the fallen goblins. Still, there were others who were keen to get stuck in, including Spoiler and his lads. The trouble was, the fence and Scarback's orcs proved a very nasty combination, and 4 of the big un boar riders were brought down. Gurmlis, seeing his chance to show Khurnag that he was made of the right stuff, charged alone into the swivel gunners, happy in the knowledge that they had had no time to reload, and killed all 3 of them. He held back, however, from charging the large regiment of orc pirates. He preferred to go in alongside Khurnag. There was a momentary pause, the only movement being Sea Boss Scarback's pirate orcs turning to face Khurnag. Then, with a cry of Waagh, in went Khurnag and his lads, joined by Gurmlis and his chariot. As they crashed in, Khurnag and Scarback found themselves locked in personal combat, everyone else far too busy with their own butchery to become involved. Try as he might, Sea Boss Scarback could not harm the mighty war boss, but Khurnag's huge cleaver-bladed spear much blooded the orc pirate and brought him down. The boar riders and their snorting mounts tore into many other pirate orcs, with Gurmlis's chariot also cutting several down. Perhaps the pirate orcs regretted their lack of armour. More likely they simply died cursing anything and everything. Whatever their dying thoughts, the few still living inevitably broke and ran, only to be ridden down and ground into the dirt by the boar's hooves and chariot wheels. The battle was ended. Sea Boss Scarback's Greenskin Corsairs were no more. And still, more regiments of the Waagh were only just arriving.